Hello, good morning. Can everyone hear me? We're good? No? No? Okay, sorry. Good morning and welcome to this morning's panel entitled The Buddha and Yoga. There are two speakers today. Unfortunately, Dr. Ray is not able to make it, so I'll be reading his paper in his stead. The first paper is by Professor Robert DeCaroli. He is the Associate Professor of Art History at George Mason University. His paper is entitled Holiness, Heat, and Hunger, Sculpting States of Mind.
So I feel particularly fortunate to be here today, not just to be in the midst of such wonderful scholars and colleagues, such an enthusiastic crowd that would give up their Friday to be here, but also because I was introduced by a former student, Jessa, and I was also particularly delighted to see that Christopher Chappell is in the audience, and it was in Professor Chappell's class many, many years ago that I took my very, very first course on Indian religion, so I feel like there's a wonderful sort of continuity here today. My topic, which I can see better now, is Holiness, Heat, and Hunger, Sculpting States of Mind. As described by both yoga manuals and in the late Vedic literary tradition, tapas, or heat, is the byproduct of intense physical and mental austerities. And this concept refers to both a reserve of potent, purifying spiritual energy and to literal heat that is often, but not exclusively, produced through intense ascetic practices, self-discipline, and self-mortification. One of the most frequently encountered techniques for producing tapas and the purification that it engenders involves undertaking periods of fasting. For example, as early as the Rig Veda, the concepts of heat and hunger were already associated, and in the Shatapatha Brahmanas, it is stated quite directly that the whole practice of tapas is when one abstains from food. Such descriptions call to mind well-known, albeit relatively rare, forms of the Buddha or future Buddha, in which he appears emaciated. The earliest known examples of this subject were created in the ancient region of Gandhara, which now encompasses parts of northern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan, and includes images like the famous examples, the one seen here from Takhti Bai, or Seri Balol, as well as the one from Sikri, seen here. It is this earliest corpus of examples dating from the 1st to the 4th century CE that concern us here. References to the importance of fasting and its connection to the production of tapas can shed light on the significance that emaciated images of Shakyamuni held for audiences in the early centuries of the Common Era. Textual sources that predate the images describe individuals who undertake extended periods of fasting as becoming purified through their ordeal, which was understood as burning off mortal imperfections. Visual representations of Shakyamuni demonstrating this form of exceptional self-discipline might therefore be read as intentionally associating the Buddha with these very specific states of elevated purity. Before considering why some members of the early Buddhist community chose to represent Shakyamuni in such a state of privation, it is helpful to recall that Buddhism was still expanding during these centuries, and these fasting images were produced alongside some of the earliest Buddhist images in the region, before any expectations of traditional or canonical artistic forms had become firmly established. As recorded in several narrative texts which relate portions of the Buddha's biography, there are two possible moments of fasting with which we might associate these images. Most scholars have followed Alfred Fouché in connecting these emaciated Buddha statues to a 6-year period of fasting that took place after Siddhartha prior to Siddhartha's attainment of Buddhahood. This event occurred when, after abandoning his decadent existence at court, Prince Siddhartha adopted a life of the ascetic and undertook a period of intense self-mortification alongside a group of like-minded hermits. During this time, he surpassed them all in his rigor and self-discipline, taking the traditional practices to self-punishing extremes. For example, the Buddhacharita describes him as having wasted away so that only skin and bone remained, with fat and flesh and blood all gone. The Mahasachika Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya is more visceral in its description, stating that the bones of my spine, when bent and straightened, were like a row of spindles through the lack of food. As the beams of an old shed stick out, so did my ribs stick out through the lack of food. Given these descriptions, It's understandable why scholars have linked this period of Shakyamuni's life to the emaciated images. However, recent scholarship has suggested a second possibility that takes place shortly after this first period of fasting. After enduring the 6-year period of privation, Shakyamuni ultimately concludes that this path of intense self-punishment is not conducive to his goals, and resolves, therefore, to break his fast. He does so by accepting a meal of rice milk offered by a woman named Sujata in some of our sources, and immediately after doing so, he heads to Bodh Gaya, where he ultimately achieves enlightenment and attains Buddhahood. What follows is a second period of fasting. This one lasts for 49 days. Over this period, a number of miraculous events occur, and as the Buddha reflects on his recent enlightenment, but throughout this time, and despite these extraordinary circumstances, this meal fed to him by Sujata remains his only food. Some scholars, notably Robert Brown, has argued that the second period of fasting is what's depicted in some of these reliefs. Seen here, for instance, on the Seri Balol example. What happens at the end of this period of the second period of fasting is that two merchants are traveling through the wood, Trapasa and Balika are their names, when their cart is mysteriously stopped suddenly. It turns out that it's a local goddess who has trapped the wheels of their cart because she wants to inform them that there's a Buddha nearby. I'm deeply intrigued by this. The two merchants venture into the woods, offer food to the Buddha, breaking this second period of fasting, and therefore also becoming the first lay donors to Buddhism. And the argument is that that's the scene that we see here on the pedestal of this first image that I showed you here, indicating that perhaps one, but maybe two different scenes from the Buddha's life are being represented in these images. Yet no matter the narrative moment that's being depicted, it still might be asked what significance fasting held, and why some Buddhists elected to depict the Buddha in this weakened state. Understanding the significance of this sort of self-discipline requires asking what practitioners traditionally hope to achieve by undertaking such hardships. As stated previously, the production of tapas was an immediate consequence of these austerities, but if the early literature is any indication, rarely was this an end in itself. Rather, the goal seems to have frequently been purification through the removal of both spiritual and physical imperfections. The earliest literary references to tapas appear in the Rig Veda, in which the gods are beseeched to provide fiery heat capable of driving off the evil spirits, or rakshasas. By the time of the Atharva Veda, however, the tapas is generated by the ritual expert himself and is used to expel unwanted or unclean influences. The authors of the Brahmanas subsequently elaborated this process and developed the notion of tapas as a ritually generated means of purification. In this literature, the details of a consecration process known as diksha are explained, and its success was in part contingent on generating tapas through fasting. This undertaking requires that the sacrificer ready himself for the role of officiating a ritual by undergoing an elaborate set of preparations aimed at purifying the body. This ritual, purifying his body, his ritual implements, and his environs. In this system, the ritual purity of the sacrifice is assured by the consuming heat of actual fire, which burns off and drives away that which is not pure. The association between heat and purity also provides the logic that underpins the concept of self-purification through fasting. In this case, it is the heat generated through fasting that consumes the body and leaves behind only that which is purified by the ordeal. The fires of hunger, stoked by steadfast mental effort, provide the crucible that purify and transform the practitioner. Typically, these fasts, as described in the Brahmanas and in later sources, lasted for a set amount of time, ranging from a few days to a month, during which time only specially prepared milk was drunk. The conditions of specific fasts varied from case to case, as, for example, in one version of the month-long fast, wherein the amount of nourishment one consumed was contingent on the phases of the moon. No matter the specific conditions, however, the textual tradition invariably draws a parallel between the consuming heat of fire and the consuming heat of the body's hunger, both of which were believed to leave behind only that which had been purified and free of pollution. In the case of the practitioners themselves, this pollution was associated with their own mortality. The Shatapatha Brahmana asserts that this process of burning off human impurities is of vital importance because, and I quote here, what is human is inauspicious to the sacrifice. The success of the ritual is therefore contingent on the practitioner attaining a state free of those mortal qualities that might hinder interaction with the divine. The text goes on to clarify this requirement by stating, he who is consecrated becomes one of the deities. In short, the successful completion of this process allows the practitioner to achieve something akin to a divine state. The nature of this apotheosis is hinted at in another passage in the text, which stipulates, after the completion of the sacrifice, he divests himself of the vow with the text, now I am who I really am. For in entering the vow, he becomes, as it were, non-human. And as it would not be becoming for him to say, I enter from truth into untruth, and as in fact he now again becomes a man, let him therefore divest himself of the vow with the text, now I am who I really am. The passage describes a moment at the end of the ritual when the practitioner is releasing the elevated state he has attained and is once again returning to his status as a mere human. The phrasing makes it clear that for the duration of the vow, in this case a fast, the practitioner has become a non-human, or amanusha. This claim might be confusing at first, but another look at the sources reveals the term's meaning in this context. Frequent references to non-humans appear in litanies of demigods, wherein the word is used for a broad and inclusive designation for divinities and spirits. The word is not easily translated, but it refers to a class of divine beings that are above humans and therefore has connotations suggesting the supernatural and the superhuman. For the writers of the Shatapatha Brahmana, it would seem that the purification in the hunger-stoked fires of tapas elevated the practitioner into a state that transcended his humanity and made him akin to the gods with whom he was expected to interact in the performance of his ritual duties. A variation of this sentiment is suggested in a passage found in the Yoga Sutras, which states that from austerity arises the destruction of impurity and the perfection of the body and the senses. The text goes on to clarify that when coupled with self-study, austerities provide unity with the desired deity. The implication is that the practitioner is preparing himself by removing those things which make him unworthy of self-identification with the divine focus of his devotion. Certainly there are differences between the Yoga Sutras and the Brahmanas, and they are significant, but in both cases, fasting and the production of tapas are identified as being conducive to cultivating one's divine nature and being effective in removing the impediments of impurity. If the prevalence of these sentiments, which links fasting to divinity, is any indication of widespread views at the time, it is worth reassessing the significance of Shakyamuni's emaciated state in early Gandharan sculpture. The sculptural works of Gandhara, due to their stylistic and cultural links to the Greco-Roman world, have often been described as emphasizing the Buddha's humanity, or as being more representative of a human-centered and naturalistic worldview when compared to the works of the same period which occurred in other parts of South Asia. By contrast, for example, the early works or the early images from Mathura have often been characterized as invoking visual associations with gods because their wide eyes, broad shoulders, and frontal stance are closely linked to sculptural forms of yakshas and other local deities found in many parts of the subcontinent. Even the pronounced bellies and broad chests characteristic of the Mathuran sculptural forms have repeatedly been described as being indicative of yogic practice and breath control. Because of these visual ties to depictions of deities and academic assumptions regarding the bodily shape of yogins, early Mathuran works were often regarded as being more spiritual, introspective, or contemplative than their counterparts in the Northwest. The resulting characterization of early Buddhist imagery, therefore, has tended to reinforce and perpetuate rather simplistic tropes of the West as worldly and the East as mystical. These descriptions are particularly salient to the current discussion because the exposed anatomies of the emaciated images have been hailed as the quintessential example of the Gandharan fixation with physical forms at the expense of deeper spiritual truths. In light of the textual material previously discussed, it seems advisable to rethink that characterization. Although naturalistic in style, the subject matter of the emaciated images is intensely spiritual and is tied to yogic concepts as deeply and perhaps even more explicitly than their Mathuran counterparts. There is a shared logic in the way the sculptors from both regions sought to visually represent the spiritual powers of Shakyamuni. Artists working in each style drew from pre-existing traditions to emphasize the purity of Shakyamuni, And in so doing, they produced vastly different visual forms, but nevertheless highlighted Shakyamuni's supernatural traits. The gaunt, emaciated images of Gandhara and the plump, bold types from Mathura may seem to have nothing in common, but just as the Mathuran artists forged visual ties between Shakyamuni and images of deities, so too the Gandharan sculptures represented him in the exalted state of an ascetic, sanctified by self-mortification. The emaciated images not only provided viewers visual evidence of Shakyamuni's exceptional self-discipline and conviction, they also invoke his attainment of the divine states mentioned in the literature and identify him as surpassing human imperfections. The artists in Gandhara, just like their counterparts in Mathura, drew upon recognizable visual forms associated with divinity and spiritual might, and in so doing, present a figure worthy of veneration and respect. These connections suggest that there are good reasons to look for similarities in the motivations for artistic production, and that such inquiries may reveal concerns which transcend regional differences. By looking beyond the surfaces of the bold Mathuran types and the emaciated Gandharan images, we can identify similarities in the choices made by the artists and the donors responsible for their production. Rather than showing the teacher at a moment of weakness or emphasizing his human frailty, the sculptors of the Gandharan emaciated images were drawing upon the visual language of asceticism to reveal Shakyamuni in the midst of a spiritually charged ordeal that captured him at his most pure, perfected, and divine. Thank you.